When my brother stood up at our family's Thanksgiving dinner and told 34 relatives that I had been stealing from our mother, I did not cry. I didn't throw anything, didn't scream, didn't fall apart the way he was clearly expecting me to. I folded my napkin, set it on the table beside my plate, and said, as evenly as I could manage, that I would be out on the dock if anyone wanted to hear my side. Nobody came. What they didn't know, what none of them knew. While they sat in that candlelit dining room passing around his printed bank statements, was that I had spent 3 months quietly documenting every dollar that had disappeared from my mother's account, and none of it traced back to me. 4 days after that dinner, 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Unit knocked on the glass door of my brother's office at a Bay Street law firm in downtown Toronto and asked him to explain 17 unauthorized e-transfers, totaling $43,200 from our mother's RRSP account. He was walked out of the building in front of his colleagues at 4:40 on a Friday afternoon. But I need to start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding who we were to each other and who we were in that family for a very long time before any of this happened. My name is Joelle. I'm 33 years old and I work as a freelance bookkeeper and financial administrator out of a small office in the West End of Toronto. It's not a flashy career. I spend my days in spreadsheets, reconciling accounts for small business owners who need someone detail-oriented and, honestly, a bit obsessive about accuracy. Which I am. I've been that way since I was a child. I was the kid who color-coded her school binders and kept a running tally of library books, organized by return date. My mother found it endearing. My brother found it irritating. My brother is 2 years older than me. He went to law school at Osgoode Hall. He clerked for a federal judge. He landed at a mid-sized corporate firm on Bay Street and billed $400 an hour and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Our parents, our father especially before he died, talked about him the way some people talk about a favorite hockey team. Constantly, proudly, with a specific kind of brightness that I spent most of my childhood waiting to see directed at me. It never quite was. Not in the same way. I was loved. I want to be clear about that. My parents were not cruel people. But there was always a hierarchy in our house that I understood before I had words for it, the way children understand most things that are never said aloud. My brother's milestones were celebrated. Mine were acknowledged. His stumbles were forgiven quickly. Mine were held up, sometimes, as cautionary examples. Once, in my early 20s, I made a minor error on a family tax return I was helping prepare. A small mistake, caught and corrected before filing, completely inconsequential. My brother mentioned it at Christmas dinner 4 years later. Just casually, in passing, like it was a known fact about me. A label that had been quietly attached to my name and was simply being read aloud for the room. I stopped keeping score a long time before our father died. Somewhere in my late 20s, I had accepted that this was the family I had, and that trying to change its architecture was a waste of energy I didn't have. I poured that energy into my work instead. I built a client list. I saved money. I was careful and I was quiet and I got on with my life. Then our father died very suddenly of a cardiac event at 61. It was fast and it was devastating, and it left my mother alone with an estate she didn't fully understand. A house in Burlington, a cottage in Muskoka, 2 RRSPs, a small investment portfolio, and a tangle of joint accounts that needed to be reorganized carefully and properly. My mother was 67, recently retired, and genuinely frightened by the paperwork. My brother offered to help. That lasted approximately 1 week before he called and said the firm was in the middle of a significant merger. He simply didn't have the bandwidth right now. And could I take it on in the interim, just until things settled down at work? I said yes. I always said yes. For 2 years, I managed everything. I set up automatic bill payments. I tracked the investment account monthly. I handled the transfers when accounts needed to be moved into my mother's sole name, dealt with the CRA correspondence, filed her taxes, and spent hours on hold with various financial institutions explaining again and again that my father had passed away. And yes, she had the death certificate. And yet, she was the sole beneficiary. I didn't charge my mother anything. It was family. But I documented every single thing, compulsively, the way I document everything in my professional life, because some part of my brain is simply incapable of leaving a ledger without a corresponding record. I created a shared folder on Google Drive. Every transaction I made on my mother's behalf was captured there. Screenshots of e-transfers with timestamps, photos of receipts, notes explaining the purpose of each payment. Every check I deposited on her behalf, every utility bill, every fee paid to her financial advisor. I set it up from the very beginning, partly out of professional habit, and partly because something in the quieter part of my mind said that a clear record was not optional. It said, without using words, that there would come a day when I would need this. I didn't examine that feeling too closely at the time. I just kept filing. About 3 months before Thanksgiving, during my regular monthly review of my mother's investment account, I noticed something that didn't fit. Small withdrawals had started appearing. $500 in July, $650 in early August, $780 at the end of August, and then a few more through September, each one slightly larger than the last. None of them matched any bill or expense I recognized. They had been made via e-transfer to an account number I didn't know. I flagged them in my notes, dated the entries, saved the screenshots. I didn't raise it with anyone immediately, because I wanted to understand the pattern first. I assumed, charitably, that my mother might have started making small personal transfers. She hadn't mentioned to me. A donation to her church. A gift to one of the grandchildren. I made a mental note to sit down with her at Thanksgiving and go through the full account summary together. Go over everything line by line. Make sure she understood and felt informed. I never got that chance. The cottage in Muskoka had been in our family since I was 8. My brother's wife had overseen a substantial renovation of the property a few years after our father died. A new kitchen, redone bathrooms, a proper deck where there used to be a listing wooden platform, and my mother had contributed to the cost. I had handled the paperwork for that financial arrangement too. It had not been an insignificant amount, and the loan documentation lived in a subfolder in the same Google Drive. 34 people came to Thanksgiving that October. Aunts and uncles and cousins, my brother's in-laws, several family friends who had known my parents since the 1980s. The cottage dining room had been extended with folding tables covered in matching ivory linen, and the whole place smelled of my mother's tourtière, which she makes only at Thanksgiving and Christmas. She'd been in the kitchen since 10 in the morning, and she was glowing the way she always glows when she has a full house to feed. I helped her carry plates. I poured wine. I sat at the far end of the table between two cousins I don't see often enough and thought, genuinely, that it was a lovely evening, that this year would just be a warm, uncomplicated Thanksgiving. Dessert hadn't even been brought out when my brother stood up and tapped the side of his wine glass with a fork. He had a cream-colored folder in his other hand. The kind from Staples, with the 2 metal prongs inside for securing paper. He set his glass down and opened the folder and said he needed to raise something difficult, something he had been sitting with for months, something he felt the family deserved to know about, because transparency, that word, 3 times in the first 2 minutes, was something he believed in. He said he had asked a colleague from the firm to review our mother's banking records with him, and what they had found was deeply troubling. He had wanted to come to me privately. First, he said. This delivered while looking directly at me with an expression of rehearsed sorrow. But when he'd tried to raise his concerns, he'd felt stonewalled. He had never once raised any concern with me. Not one conversation, not one text, not one email. He slid printed pages out of the folder and passed them around the table. His voice was controlled and precise, and he cited the number $43,200. He named specific dates. He pointed to patterns in the withdrawals. He pointed to my name as the account administrator. He said the word misappropriation. And then he said my name and said I had been taking money from our mother for 2 years. The room went completely still. I could hear the fire in the hearth across the cottage. I could hear someone's chair shift very slightly on the wooden floor. I remember my mother's face. She was staring at the tablecloth, pressing both hands flat against the surface as though she needed to feel something solid beneath them. She did not look up at me. I remember one of my aunts pressing her lips together and staring at the far wall. I remember a cousin on my brother's side very slowly sliding the printed pages back toward him, without looking at them, which told me she was choosing not to examine them at all, just deciding to believe. I waited until he finished speaking. The silence after he sat down stretched for what felt like a very long time. I said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you and Mum, privately." He said no. He said this was a family matter and the family should be present for it. I looked at my mother. She still wasn't looking at me. So I stood up. My hands were shaking. I want to be honest about that. I was not made of stone. But my voice stayed level. I said that I was going to go sit on the dock and that if anyone wanted to hear my side of things, I would be out there. Then I walked through the cottage, through the kitchen, out the back screen door that's still stuck in the same spot, but it had been sticking since I was 8 years old, and I went and sat down at the end of the dock in the October dark, over Lake Muskoka, with no jacket on. The water was black and very still. The lights from the cottage made long yellow rectangles on the surface, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold. I sat there and I waited. After about 20 minutes, I could hear, faintly through the walls, the sound of conversation resuming inside. Then someone laughed at something. The sound of it was extraordinary to me in that moment. That ordinary laugh, in that ordinary room, while I sat outside in the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then I stood up. I went back inside. I took my overnight bag from the room I'd been set up in, gave my mother a brief hug. She hugged me back stiffly and said nothing, said a quiet goodbye to the room in general, and walked out to my car. My brother texted me at 10:12 p.m. "I gave you a chance to come clean tonight. I hope you know what comes next." I did not reply. When I got home to my Toronto apartment, I called a lawyer. A woman I'd done bookkeeping work for a few years earlier who had since opened her own small general practice in Etobicoke. I'd always thought well of her. She was careful, direct, and had a quality of listening that made you feel heard without being managed. I left a message at close to midnight. She called me back at 7 the next morning. For 3 days, I worked. I pulled everything from the Google Drive folder. 2 years of documentation, organized chronologically, annotated, cross-referenced. I wrote a plain language summary of every transaction I had made on my mother's behalf, with supporting documentation attached to each entry. It was, I will not pretend otherwise, a genuinely satisfying document to build. The kind of document that answers every possible question before anyone thinks to ask it. Then I turned to the July through September withdrawals. I laid them out against the figures my brother had cited at dinner, one by one. They matched precisely, down to the dollar, down to the date. He had not been trying to frame me in some elaborate, constructed way. What he had done was take money from our mother's investment account, money I had no part in moving, and then pointed to my name as the account administrator and let the implication land where it would. He'd built the accusation on the assumption that no one would trace those specific e-transfers back to their actual recipient. He had assumed I kept sloppy records. He had assumed I'd fall apart at that dinner table, maybe go red and tearful and look guilty in front of everyone. He had assumed 30 years of being the quiet, overlooked sister meant I didn't know how to protect myself. He did not know what kind of records I keep. My lawyer reviewed everything over 2 days and was direct with me. My documentation was clean. The paper trail pointed clearly elsewhere, and what I had captured was consistent with fraud over $5,000 and breach of trust under the Criminal Code of Canada, both indictable offenses. She also pointed out, with the particular steadiness of someone who has said difficult things many times before, that what my brother had done at that table, in front of 34 people, with printed materials designed to look official, was defamatory, and I had the text he'd sent me afterward, and at least 2 cousins who I believed would tell the truth about what they had witnessed. I filed a report with the Toronto Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit on a Tuesday morning. I sat across from an officer who took his time with the documentation, didn't rush me, and didn't make me feel like I was wasting anyone's time. I told the whole story from the beginning. 4 days later, on a Saturday evening, I was sitting in my apartment eating leftover Thai food and watching a nature documentary, and genuinely, for the first time in a week, not thinking about any of this. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in once adrenaline clears, and I had reached it when my phone began going. My mother's number. A number I didn't recognize. My mother again. One of my aunts. What had happened? 2 officers had arrived at my brother's firm on Friday afternoon and asked for him by name at reception. They had waited in the lobby. They had taken him to a conference room and asked him to explain 17 e-transfers from a registered investment account belonging to our mother. He was walked out of the building. His keycard was deactivated before he reached the elevator bank. The calls I received over the next 48 hours were something. My mother, who was confused and hurting, and asking questions I could not answer in a way that would make her feel better rather than worse. My sister-in-law, furious because my brother had apparently given her a version of events in which I had fabricated the evidence. 2 of my aunts calling separately, both of them upset in completely different directions. One cousin sent me a text message that said, simply, "I'm sorry we didn't come to the dock." I kept that one. The firm terminated my brother's contract within the week. Bay Street is a small world in the way that all worlds built on reputation are small, and a pending criminal investigation is not something any corporate firm wants attached to its letterhead. He was let go before any formal finding was made, which tells you something about how those decisions actually work when money and perception are involved. His wife, meanwhile, had begun going through their joint finances, trying to make sense of what had happened. What she found, beyond the accounts connected to my mother, was a second account in my brother's name that had been receiving regular transfers for approximately 18 months. The amounts didn't correspond to anything she recognized as a shared household expense. She hired her own lawyer, filed for separation before November was out. The criminal charges came through in February. Fraud over $5,000. Breach of trust. His lawyer negotiated a plea to avoid a trial that would have become permanent, publicly searchable record. He received 2 years of probation, was ordered to repay the full $43,200 to our mother, with interest calculated from the date of the first transfer, and was assigned 200 hours of community service. His legal costs, between the criminal matter and the separation proceeding, were considerable. The Bay Street career was, as a practical matter, finished. I filed the civil suit for defamation in the spring, for what he had said at that table, in front of 34 people, with documentation designed to appear credible. It settled out of court. I am not able to disclose the specific amount, but I can tell you it was enough to change things. The first thing I did was set up a proper, independent trust management arrangement for my mother's finances. A licensed professional, arm's length from the family, with full reporting and transparency built in. Something that should have been in place from the beginning when our father died. My mother agreed to it eventually, after some time and some difficult conversations. I want to be honest about my mother, because the easiest version of this story would be to say she came around quickly and cleanly, and that everything was repaired between us. That is not exactly what happened. She had sat at that Thanksgiving table and listened to her son deliver an organized, formally presented case against me. And she had believed it long enough for some of it to stick. Understanding the truth intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things, and my mother is someone who feels deeply and processes slowly. We talk. Some calls are easy, some are not. We are finding our way back, and I have made my peace with the fact that it is a path, not an arrival. The second thing I did was move to Halifax. I had no particular, logical reason to choose Halifax. A client of mine had been talking about it for almost a year, and I had looked it up once out of idle curiosity and found myself reading about it for the better part of an evening. Ocean, old stone buildings, a city at a scale that feels manageable, that doesn't ask too much of you all at once. I thought, I want to go somewhere I can walk down the street in the morning and not be the woman my brother pointed at in front of 34 people at a Thanksgiving dinner in Muskoka. I packed up my Toronto apartment, the one-bedroom I had rented for 6 years, with the faint and permanent smell of my upstairs neighbor's cooking drifting through the ceiling. And I drove east. I named the firm Hartwell Financial Services. Hartwell is my maternal grandmother's maiden name, a name that belongs entirely to me, and to nothing that happened at that cottage. It took about 8 months to build a real client base, and for roughly 3 of those months, I was genuinely uncertain whether it was going to work. But the thing about being careful and thorough, and a bit obsessive about accuracy, is that it tends to build trust over time, quietly, in the way that quiet things build. Word moved around. Referrals came. I'm not running a large operation. I work with small business owners, local people, the kind of clients who need someone who will actually pick up the phone and who remembers the details. But it is entirely mine, and I built it myself, from nothing, after everything. The mark of that night is still there, if I'm being honest with you. I feel it. Sometimes when I pick up an unexpected call from a family number and notice my chest tighten before I've even answered. I feel it when I'm closing out an account and find myself checking something 3 times, 4 times. Not because I think I've made an error, but because something in me is still listening for the accusation. I don't think those things fully go away, but they have gotten quieter. They have moved to the background of a life that is, most days, genuinely good. What I come back to when I think about that Thanksgiving is the dock. Sitting there in the October dark over black water, with no jacket and the light from the cottage not quite reaching me, and the sound of people carrying on with dinner inside. The particular, cold quality of waiting for someone who does not come. For a long time, I thought that was the worst part. The 20 minutes, the silence, the fact that not one person walked out there. But I've changed my mind. Because what I also remember is that I eventually stood up. I walked back inside. I collected my things. I drove home alone, in the dark, for 2.5 hours, and I did not fall apart. And I did not need anyone standing beside me. Because I had 2 years of dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced records in a Google Drive folder that my brother never knew existed. He had spent years watching me be quiet and decided that quiet meant harmless. He decided that being overlooked meant being defenseless. He decided that the invisible sister was the safe target. He should have paid closer attention. Accountants always keep receipts. So I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where being the careful, quiet one in the room turned out to be your biggest advantage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know.